Welcome back to Language of the Soul, Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins.
So, as we close the calendar year of 2024, we wanted to come to you today with the offering, the practice that, Martin, you call soul journaling.
Those two words, soul and journaling, can be used in conjunction with each other to express a lot of different ways in which we can write, that we can approach our exploration of ourselves. I wanted to convey from my soul to those listening what, with deep reverence, that means to me. Reverence to the process, reverence to the very oneness that I associate with the process. When I reference soul journaling, I'm really speaking into the idea that we all have access to the oneness that is there when we get out of our own way. So what does that mean, get out of our own way? When we quiet the mind. And it's really, as I've said before, a three-step process. It first and foremost requires a restful approach to life. It requires a willingness to engage deeply in a stillness practice. And lastly, it is a call to connect directly with the soul within us. It has an element of reverence. However, it is not a form of worship. And it's an important distinction, because when people speak of worship, I hear in my being the expression of a God that exists outside of us. For me, soul journaling is a pathway into the infinite that dwells within each and every one of us. It requires, and I use that word requires because it really does require a level of conviction, a willingness to leap into the idea that each and every one of us has an inner divinity that we are unconscious of. I'll offer a quote here from a conversation that Meher Baba had with one of his followers, a man by the name of Naushirwan, in which he shared, "You, Naushirwan, are God in human form. Each one of my disciples here are God in human form. But you are unconscious of your divinity. I am conscious of my divinity and can declare my godhood. But how do I make you conscious of your divinity? I give you the gift of conviction." Now that word conviction, it's a tricky one because it's been used in many instances by individuals telling other individuals how they should live, how they should be. That's not what I'm speaking of. I'm speaking of inner conviction, the willingness to dive deeply into oneself, to know oneself more fully, to know one's divinity, not in a hierarchical sense, but in a deep, reverent sense of your own being. That's what, in my mind, is being accessed through soul journaling. To be willing to say that being well rested, to be restful in one's approach to life, in order to be present, to have the presence of being, the presence of mind, that allows for us to recognize with conviction who we are and how we can show up in the world. The actual practice of soul journaling, I can speak from personal experience in saying I've written thousands and thousands and thousands of pages over the last, say, 15 years. Many of those pages ended up in my book, but the vast majority of them weren't about producing anything. They were about me knowing more deeply myself. It was me getting out of the way and letting the inner voice speak. And then ultimately for me to be able to embody that inner voice. In other words, step into that sense of divinity in my own unique way. We all have it. It all exists within us. It's, for example, the reason why Yeshua ben Joseph in the eight Beatitudes, he begins each Beatitude with the phrasing, blessed. We take, for example, the first Beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He's not saying if you do these particular things, you will become whatever they are. It's already so. It's inherent to each and every one of us. It doesn't matter what we've done. It doesn't matter even what we're doing in that moment. What matters is, what are we willing to practice within ourselves?
If I may speak to soul journaling myself, I want to offer a different side of it because I'm at a different point in the practice of soul journaling. It remains the most challenging one for me to engage with. When I engage in writing, and I have a history of writing analytically, right? To review things, to review a movie, to break something down into pieces and to talk about it. There has been that dance with the ego, the surface that often occurs for me when I begin writing. And the conviction for me there is to just stick with it, to keep writing. A lot of my writing wouldn't appear or make sense to anyone else because it's often this process of getting out of my own way, as you say, right? Moving through the ego into the heart and into the soul. And the more that I do it, when I get that ping, that sense of, I need to sit down and do some soul journaling, the more the soul's voice, and this is my voice. I think this is very important to say because I struggle with the God on high, right? The outside source. That conviction that's coming from within, the more I journal, the more that is present there in my words right off the bat. And it's less of a tussle or a dance, the jitterbug versus the waltz is something that you and I often joke about. And this has been the biggest challenge that I've framed as a challenge, that I've turned into a narrative of the soul journaling is hard. It's not that the soul journaling is hard, it's that I've chosen to look at it as being hard. I've chosen to look at it as being a leap that I can't make like the others, when in fact all of it is one and the same, and it's just that softening there. Conviction can be a hard word in our society. I think that that's definitely something that I've experienced and that I've bumped up against hard edges, sharp edges within our work. My egoic mind says it's safe, which means that it's correct, which means that it's right.
That word conviction that Baba speaks of, Meher Baba speaks of in speaking to Naushirwan, I give you the gift of conviction. Through the work that I share with people, and in particular around the notion of knowledge versus fact or information or anything else, something, this notion of truth that's presented in our world as a kind of be-all, end-all. My experience of truth is that there's factual truth and then there's personal truth. This personal truth is born of knowledge, the knowledge of the embodied knowledge that comes with the experience of the practice within that conviction, the willingness to over and over again write into what it means in any given moment to explore what one's truth is and realize that the truth, for example, I may have a conflict with another, and I don't want to speak of any specific instance because I don't want anyone to feel unfairly cast into the story of conflict. Like all human beings, I've had them. And given my history, I had probably more than many. And what I had to learn to delve into was how much of this is about the what and how much is this about the how. The how of what happened has already happened. The how am I relating to it now? And the recognition that, for instance, when I've had conflicts and then sought my truth around them, as I've written into it, often day after day, I'll feel say initially, I'll still feel the sense of conflict initially. And then as I delve over and over again into what's mine in this conflict, what's not mine in this conflict, how am I communicating in ways that either do or don't allow me to own my actions, my words, my choices? All of what I'm describing is at the very essence of soul journaling. It's looking at the deeper truth around any given instance and recognizing not just the what, but the heart and the soul within the situation, and getting to the point where what I can share with another has been well examined. I may not ultimately say something or respond to the other in this instant with something that would be seen as being nice. However, my practice is to get to some place where I can be kind, that there's both truth and compassion in what I share. What I ultimately share in the midst of a conflict may not always, at first glance, look like resolution or healing. But part of that is because I learned over and over again what it was like to seek peace without truth, to just smooth the waters without acknowledging the whole picture.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like a lot of people are familiar with that practice to smooth the waters without seeing the whole picture.
Right, and acknowledging the whole picture so that if what's going to be ultimately met is a degree of truth, it needs to have been brought out into the light so that the healing and the growth around it can occur. We don't always have the luxury that the other in the conflict is going to engage with the same depth. In fact, it's often the case that they don't. But that doesn't mean we don't do this work. It doesn't mean we don't meet them there.
Right.
And if we're not meeting them there, then we're really not meeting ourselves there. We're not really living, as Baba spoke, from a place of conviction.
From a place of conviction, yeah, that personal conviction, personal truth and factual truth, other people's truths, everyone coming to the table. And it is that whole picture. That's where I characterize and narrativize it as a struggle a lot of the time. What can feel so hard for me is feeling the personal truth of my own divinity and knowing that everyone has that spark, that glow, that light. And the way that I've often experienced conflict, the smoothing over for me is if other people aren't feeling it, then I shouldn't feel it. And yet it directly relates to what you just said about me choosing to then not feel it. And it's not out of solidarity. We scope back and look at the notion of solidarity in our societies. The real solidarity is just continuing to practice what we're talking about today. Rest, meditate, soul journal, show up with your personal truth and with those factual truths into a space where there may be conflict and where someone might not be able to meet you with their own personal truth, where they smooth it out or they walk away in frustration or anger and they hold the conflict as the end point. This is something that's really important to note right now. Conflict being this be all end all end point where it's not that at all. It really is only indicative of the greater depths and truths of one's own personal experience that still need to be explored and embraced and be given discernment. I hear you talk about forgiveness, gratitude, and trust being foundational in healing and growth.
Well, foundational to the expression of love that we give into the world, right?
Right.
A love that doesn't contain forgiveness, gratitude, and trust. What kind of love is it then?
There are three other things that come to mind when I think about forgiveness, gratitude, and trust in relationship to love. And that is what we're speaking of today. How, the discernment that happens in the how. All of these things go hand in hand. And the journaling itself, the writing into it, the thousands and thousands of pages that you've written, maybe 1,000 pages that I've written. What I think is kind of delicious about this episode right now is that both you and I are speaking from different points of our own journeys. And in terms of a healing and growth journey, you are speaking from this point of embodiment with soul journaling, and I'm speaking from a point of becoming embodied with it. And the thing there is, I don't want to make a distinction. I want to make a discernment with that, because there is a different degree of conviction that's coming from each of us because of where we're at in that process. And it's not to say that there is a lack of where I'm at, because you're coming from a place of embodiment simply because you have to practice it. You have made that choice every moment to take that leap and to take that leap and take that leap to be embodied, to hold that soul journaling practice as sacred. I'm still feeling the edges of it being a sacred practice. I think that's really important to share with everyone as we talk about what it really is, what we're really doing, and how unique it is to all of us. You know, the way that everyone is going to be in conversation with oneself is going to look incredibly different. And as long as that personal truth unfolds and unfolds and unfolds, this is the beauty of it. This is the gift of conviction.
When I approach soul journaling, in many ways, what I am writing is the answer to a prayer. While this may seem like an alien approach to prayer, in many ways, both the question and the answer are presented within the writing. Sometimes the writing is me sorting out what the question is. In some instances, I come in to the writing already with a clear inquiry. Regardless, it is the conviction with which I'm willing to say, at this moment, this is the clearest expression of my divinity that I can share within the writing, and I practice with that. And this is why the pages matter, because it's like any practice. The more you practice, the more embodied it becomes. I'm often less concerned, for instance, as I teach individuals these practices around the meditation within Tao Yin, the practice of soul journaling, from the perspective of teaching the relative beginner and knowing at the same time that while I refer to that individual as a beginner, I'm also in essence teaching them to continue to practice being in the practice through the lens of being a beginner. Because whether I've written tens of thousands of pages or I've written one, I need that beginner's lens. I need to treat the writing through a fresh lens. I need to allow whatever experience I've had to remain, while valued, also acknowledging it as existing within a prior moment. And that within this moment, the writing is calling me to this, whatever this is, and the sense of immediacy. And that's in part expressed in that word, the gift of conviction, that phrase, the gift of conviction. In giving the gift of conviction, I'm in essence saying every bit of writing matters, even if in a given moment nothing seems to have arrived. And so I'm always writing from the perspective of a recognition that not just myself, but that everyone can have a direct connection with their soul, with the infinite within themselves. That's my definition of divinity. It is not connection with an external God. It is the recognition that we are all infinite beings. And the writing is teaching us, in addition to being restful, in addition to being still within our practice, in addition to being willing to let go into the warm embrace of that soulful presence within us, we're able to recognize our own habitual patterns, the filtered stories through which we see ourselves that prevent us from seeing our own divinity. We're obviously sharing this in a time of the year where being still, being quiet, letting go into the great mystery is an integral part of the winter season, of the seasonal element of water, and water being that extraordinary metaphor for the deep mystery that is our own being, our world, right? One only need to sit or stand at the edge of water to recognize what I'm expressing.
Indeed, one feels that in such a beautiful, profound, and simple way. The flow of water, the shape of water, the depths of it, and yet the translucence of it and the reflection of it. All of these real factual things, right? The factual truths of water in a poetic sense is a reflection of our own personal truths.
And for some, as we explore this notion of the mystery, for some, soul journaling has that poetic quality. I know that a great deal of the writing that I've done over the years often reverts into, or has reverted into, many different poetic forms. Not really any intention on my part. It's how it expresses itself through my being. I'm willing to let go into the poetry of it and the recognition that the process itself is as important as any answers that may arrive.
There are no answers without that process. That's simply the way it is. If we are choosing to show up here,
Right. And that's the stagnancy of dogma and doctrines, right? This belief that there's a set of rules concocted years, centuries, millennia ago, and it sits in some stagnant water as the be-all end-all of what the mystery is. And in that way, the world's religions have cheated humanity, have done great damage. Not just through their sanctioning of violence and repression, their willingness to step into unhealthy relationships with money and power, but in this belief that there's this hierarchical existence within the soul, within our own, each of ours divinity, that declares that it exists outside of us, it exists within some kind of power structure, and it exists in a way that declares truth as being so for all. When I hear the statements that, that people interpret in Yeshua's words, when he declares, or when Baba declares themselves as God, and the recognition that what they're saying to us is, if I am, so are you. Please practice as if that is so. And that's also within the gift of conviction. Go to your truths, go to your depths, practice life as if your depths matter, as if your divinity matters.
if you believe that it does, then others will believe that theirs matters as well. Not that yours matters. You know that your divinity matters. That's the conviction. You don't need anyone else to be putting you on a pedestal. The irony of this is so delicious, of everything being the same under a dogma or a doctrine, the stagnation, the rigidity, the rules, the letter of the law. The spirit of the law is softer, it's different. There's abundance there in a way where we speak of today with that conviction that comes from oneself is truly, truly the key to what Yeshua talks about in the Beatitudes, as you noted. I'm reminded of the first one that you quoted, because there's a willingness to be soft there, to be present to the moment at hand. He's not speaking of things solely through the lens of systems, of society, of caste. There's a deeper discernment that's happening there. There's a reminder, a remembrance. Could you read that one again, please?
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. If I may offer a perspective on that, because the word poor doesn't mean that these are people lacking in spirit. It speaks of one who has nothing and is empty. In other words, those willing not to fill their lives with material and egoic need. People willing to trust into the inner journey, to embrace letting go into a life beyond the trappings of the material.
And it goes back to, in another way, to kind of put a different lens on it, the beginner's mind, the freshness. Mastery really only happens through that freshness.
So, Ben, to bring this all together, when I speak of soul journaling, what I'm speaking of is practice being rested. Practice whatever stillness practice you engage with. Recognizing that when I say stillness practice, I literally mean quieting the mind. Not filling the mind with something good versus bad. It's the practice of quieting the mind. Because what the soul journaling is tapping into comes from a very deep whisper that can't be heard when the mind is chattering with good nor bad thoughts. It's when there's the absence of thought that the whispering soul can speak. And that's what we're writing into when we soul journal. Recognizing that it's okay at first that there be lots of chatter there. But if you keep practicing, the chatter will lessen. And then ultimately, the journaling itself will contain more and more of what you hold within yourself as being your own wisdom. And that's all that we can really ask of ourselves, is that we tap into our own wisdom and then ultimately allow that wisdom to guide how we are in the world.
Truly, in this season of water, this is how we hold ourselves and the world and everyone in it dearly through the flow of our practices.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Ben. Beautifully said. There's this quote that Baba shares that I think is just quite stunning. I am the sun which is hidden by the shadow of yourself. Cease thinking that you are your shadow, and you will find that the sun which I am is your own reality. And while that may seem like it's placing the divinity outside, what it's really, from my offering, suggesting is that when we recognize the divinity in another, celebrate that. Make that your reality.
If you'd like to learn more about Language of the Soul as a course, as the book, you can do so by visiting martinperkins.com. Over there, you're gonna check out plenty of different things, from acupuncture and herbal services, as well as our movie club, which we're continuing through these winter months. Our next film is going to be Inside Out 2. We're going to be starting off 2025 with the biggest film of 2024, so the likelihood that you've seen it and would want to share your experience with it hopefully is strong. You want to share your conviction. Join Martin at Simplicity Farm on Sunday, January 5th at 7 p.m. And then on Thursday, January 9th at 7 p.m. via Zoom, we'll all gather to share our experience of Inside Out 2. So I really want to thank you for today in particular, but more so the many months that we've spent building out our work together in the podcast. It feels rich and it feels joyful.
I too feel deeply grateful, Ben, for our shared experience. So thank you.
And thank you to everyone who has shown up and joined us. We know that we have a small audience. Sure, that's how most podcasts are. But the dedication to listen, to take that time and share something with Martin and I, really speaks to your divinity, whoever you are out there, your own soul. And I just want to acknowledge that.